Welcome to The Boring Historian. Tonight we step quietly into the streets of Victorian England to explore a world often hidden in shadow. The lives of women who survived through prostitution. Their stories were bleak, their nights long, and their struggles nearly invisible to the polite society that passed them by. If you enjoy calming, immersive history to fall asleep to, please subscribe to The Boring Historian. It helps me create more of these long, soothing journeys into the past. Also, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I'd love to know. Right. Now, let us begin. The city of London in the year 1873 was a place of contrasts. To some, it was the heart of an empire, its docks overflowing with goods from India, Africa, and the Americas, its grand streets lined with shops glittering under the glow of new gas lamps. For others, for most in fact, it was a city of misery. A city where the poor lived in alleys piled with refuse, where soot from factory chimneys darkened the sky, and where children with hollow eyes begged on every corner. On this particular night, the fog has rolled in thick and heavy, curling like smoke around the bases of the street lamps. It muffles the sound of carriage wheels and dulls the clip of horses' hooves, leaving only the uneven rhythm of footsteps, the occasional cough of a man in the shadows, and the faint ringing of church bells far away. London is alive with sound, yet it feels muted, as though the fog itself wishes to keep secrets. Eleanor Carter walks carefully along Whitechapel Road, her shawl pulled tight against the damp. She is 19 years old, though hunger and hardship have carved shadows beneath her eyes that make her appear older. Just 3 months ago, she had been employed as a laundress in a respectable household, scrubbing linen from dawn until dusk, her hands raw and cracked from lye. But when she fell ill and missed work, she was dismissed without wages, without reference, and without pity. For women like her, there were few choices: starve, beg, or sell the only thing left to sell. Herself, the cobblestones beneath her thin boots are slick with rain and grime. Every so often she passes a gin palace, its doorway glowing warmly, spilling light and laughter onto the street. Inside, sailors shout, men in dirty coats slam their mugs against wooden counters, and the sharp scent of juniper and cheap alcohol wafts out into the night air. But Eleanor cannot afford even a half-penny dram. She walks on, stomach twisting with hunger, the cold biting her fingers and cheeks. Tonight she is not looking for drink. Tonight she is looking for survival. The truth of Victorian prostitution was nothing like the sensational tales whispered by the upper classes. It was not a glamorous life of silks and jewels, nor the adventures of the courtesans who sometimes found their way into scandal sheets. For the vast majority, women like Eleanor, it was dirty, it was dangerous, and it was a slow, grinding descent into despair. In 1871, an official survey estimated there were more than 50,000 prostitutes in London alone, and perhaps double that number across England. Many were girls barely out of childhood. Some were widows. Some were factory hands or servants who had been dismissed for a mistake, or simply for becoming inconvenient. Eleanor passes by a group of women standing together under a lamp. They are dressed in worn shawls and patched skirts, their cheeks rouged with cheap pigment in an attempt to hide the exhaustion beneath. Their laughter is brittle, their eyes sharp. They eye Eleanor with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Pity, because they can see she is new. Suspicion, because newcomers meant competition. One of them mutters something under her breath, but Eleanor keeps walking. She does not yet have the courage to join them. The night deepens. A light drizzle begins to fall, beating on Eleanor's shawl. She pauses at the corner of a narrow alleyway, leaning against the damp brick as a pair of policemen stroll past. Their boots slap against the wet pavement, their voices low. Eleanor looks down, not meeting their eyes. She has already learned from bitter warning that policemen are not protectors for women like her. They may arrest her, harass her, or demand favors in exchange for leaving her be. The law itself sees her as a criminal, though the men who seek her out walk freely with no shame. Beyond the policemen, down a darker stretch of road, she sees them. Men drifting from the public houses, from the music halls, from the dim-lit taverns. Some are staggering, some walk briskly, their collar. Poverty in Victorian England was not just an inconvenience. It was a trap that swallowed people whole. For the poor, there was little margin for error. One missed week of wages, one illness, one accident could be enough to tip a woman or a family into disaster. Work was not secure, and for women like Eleanor Carter, it was often poorly paid, exhausting, and subject to the whims of an employer who could dismiss her without hesitation. Eleanor had once believed she was safe. Her job as a laundress, though hard, had at least kept her fed. She worked from dawn until long past dusk, scrubbing the linen of wealthier households. Her hands perpetually cracked and red from lye and hot water. She earned just enough to pay for her bed in a crowded lodging house and for a bowl of thin stew each evening. There was never money left for comfort, but there was survival. Then came the fever. A chill that settled into her chest, followed by days of coughing that left her too weak to work. She missed a week's labor. When she returned, pale and trembling, her employer had already replaced her. Without a reference, without savings, she was left adrift. Her family could not help her. Her father had died years earlier in an accident at the docks, and her mother had followed him to the grave not long after, worn down by years of factory work. She had one brother, but he had joined the army and disappeared abroad. For Eleanor, there was no home to return to, no safety net, no kin who could offer her shelter. She was one of thousands of young women in London who stood utterly alone. In theory, there were institutions designed to catch those who fell: workhouses, charities, reform schools. In practice, they were places of shame and suffering. The workhouse was dreaded above all. To enter it was to be stripped not only of freedom, but of dignity. Families were separated, husbands from wives, children from parents. Conditions were brutal, food was meager, and labor was relentless. It was designed not as relief, but as punishment for being poor. The thought of entering one was unbearable to Eleanor. Charities existed too, but they were few and often deeply judgmental. A woman in need might be turned away if she was suspected of immorality, or made to sit through endless sermons about her sins in exchange for a crust of bread. Many chose hunger over humiliation, and so Eleanor drifted. First came nights of searching for small jobs, carrying bundles for shopkeepers, scrubbing steps for a penny, mending shirts with borrowed needles. Each small task bought her another crust, another bed for the night. But the city was full of women like her, desperate for the same scraps of work. Demand was small, competition was endless. Soon she began to go hungry. Hunger was a relentless thing. It clawed at her stomach, made her lightheaded and weak. It blurred her thoughts, slowed her steps, and made every sound. The crack of bread in another's hand, the clink of a coin in someone else's pocket, seemed sharper, crueler. Nights stretched long, sleepless, when her belly ached and her body trembled from cold. She thought often of her mother's words. A woman must hold her virtue as her treasure, for once lost, it cannot be reclaimed. But as the days passed, those words felt less like guidance and more like a distant echo, a luxury for those who did not know what it meant to starve. It was in those nights of desperation that Eleanor first noticed how men looked at her. Not just the quick glances of passers-by, but lingering stares, suggestive smirks. Once, when she asked a man for a penny for bread, he replied with a cruel smile. "Not for nothing, girl." She fled then, shamed and furious, but the seed was planted. By the time another week had passed, her shoes wearing thin, her stomach aching so sharply she could not think, she began to understand what countless other women before her had discovered. In a city that gave them no work, no charity, no family, their only commodity was their bodies. The streets of London whispered with the knowledge, in Whitechapel, in Southwark, in Westminster. Girls as young as 12 and women as old as 50 walked the roads, waiting for men to approach. It was dangerous, filthy, degrading. But it was survival. Some earned just enough to buy bread and a bed for the night. Others found themselves trapped in cycles of drink and debt, falling further into despair. Eleanor did not make her choice in a single dramatic moment. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion. A day came when she had nothing left. No coin for food, no friend. For women like Eleanor Carter, survival in London often hinged on a single question each night. Would she have enough for a bed? The common lodging house was the cheapest refuge available to the destitute, and though it offered no comfort, it was at least 4 walls and a roof against the damp and cold. The streets of Whitechapel, Southwark, and Lambeth were crowded with such houses. Shabby buildings divided into bare rooms, each filled with narrow beds, or, in some cases, nothing more than straw spread across the floor. The price varied. For a few pennies, a woman could secure half a bed to be shared with a stranger. For less, she might be granted a space on the floor, pressed shoulder to shoulder with dozens of others. The poorest paid only a penny for what was known as a four-penny coffin, a wooden box in which they lay, sometimes with the lid loosely pulled over them as though rehearsing for their burial. On her first night in such a place, Eleanor could hardly sleep. The stench of unwashed bodies and rotting clothes filled the room, mingled with the acrid smoke of cheap candles and the ever-present reek of gin. The air was damp, heavy, and foul. Every cough seemed to echo, rattling the rafters. She knew that many around her carried diseases that spread quickly in such close quarters: tuberculosis, influenza, and worse. In the darkness, she could hear the creak of bed springs, the shuffle of restless limbs, the muffled sobs of women who had been beaten or abandoned. There was no privacy in the lodging house. Men and women slept side by side, separated at best by a curtain or a thin wall. Quarrels broke out in the night, sometimes ending in blows. Theft was common. Eleanor learned quickly to sleep with her few belongings clutched to her chest, for to let them slip aside was to wake and find them gone. And always there was the threat of being turned out. The keeper of the house, often a hard-faced woman who had long ago grown numb to pity, would show no hesitation in expelling anyone who could not pay. Those unable to produce their coins were left to wander the streets until dawn, exposed to the rain, the cold, and the dangers of the night. Yet, for all its filth and danger, the lodging house was a lifeline. To step through its warped doorway was to escape, if only for a few hours, the relentless chill of the open air. For Eleanor, a bed, even one shared with another woman, her breath sour and her body reeking of sweat, meant rest. It meant the difference between waking alive and strong enough to walk or collapsing in the gutter. Eleanor came to know the rhythms of the house. At dusk, the residents gathered, clutching their pennies, waiting for the keeper to unlock the doors. Women filed in with their shawls pulled tightly around them, faces pale and drawn. Men staggered in from the taverns, their pockets lighter than when they had left, their eyes glazed. Children trailed behind, often barefoot, some clutching scraps of bread saved from begging. Inside, the heat rose quickly, the air becoming stifling. The rooms filled with mutterings, with the clink of coins, with the scraping of bowls as thin stews were ladled out for those who could pay a little more. As night wore on, the atmosphere changed. Some drank gin until they slumped into stupor, their snores rattling the thin walls. Others grew restless, whispering, trading news of the streets, gossiping about who had been arrested, who had vanished, who had been found in the river. For women like Eleanor, who walked the streets at night to earn their bed, the lodging house became more than shelter, became a gathering place, a network of the desperate. Here, she met others who lived as she did, women hardened by years in the trade, their faces painted by candlelight into masks of defiance and weariness. They spoke to her in low voices, advising her on which corners were safer, which policemen could be bribed. Each woman was in competition with the others, and every kindness carried an edge of calculation. To share bread tonight might mean receiving help tomorrow when a violent client threatened. To lend a shawl might mean gaining an ally in a quarrel with the keeper. It was a grim economy of favors, a fragile web of survival spun across the rotting timbers of the lodging house. For Eleanor, every morning brought the same trial. At dawn, the keeper would sweep through the rooms, rattling sticks against bed frames, shouting for the residents to rise. Those who lingered risked being thrown out. Stumbling into the gray light of morning, Eleanor would feel the chill seep back into her bones, the fog curling around her once more. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and already she was counting the hours until she must return, coins in hand, to claim her place again. The lodging house was no home, no refuge in the truest sense. If the common lodging houses were the beds of the poor, then the gin palaces were their escape. They glittered like beacons across the dark streets of London, bright, loud, and inviting, with glass windows that spilled light onto the pavement and doors that swung open to the sound of laughter and music. For a few pennies, a man or woman could lose themselves for an hour, numb the gnaw of hunger, and forget at least briefly, the weight of misery. By the time Eleanor Carter found her way inside one, she had already walked the streets for weeks. Her feet ached constantly, her belly was never full, and her nerves were frayed from the encounters of the night. Men had jeered at her, bargained with her as if she were no more than a scrap of cloth at market, and sometimes left her bruised in dark alleys. She had heard the other women speak of gin as a comfort, a medicine for shame and hunger. "It warms you up and makes you forget," one said with a bitter laugh, "till you can't remember why you ever wanted to stop." The first time Eleanor stepped through the doors of a gin palace, she was overwhelmed. The room blazed with light from enormous chandeliers, brighter than anything she had ever seen in her years of drudgery. Mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the glow, so that it seemed she had stumbled into some grand hall rather than a simple drinking den. The counters gleamed with brass fittings, polished daily, and behind them stood shelves stacked with glittering bottles, their contents glowing amber, red, and green beneath the lamps. But beneath the sheen, the truth remained. The customers were not men of refinement. They were dock workers with hands scarred from rope and timber, factory men with soot still clinging to their hair, soldiers on leave, and sailors fresh off the ships. They roared and shouted, their cheeks flushed, their voices carrying across the room like thunder. Women were there too. Some prostitutes like Eleanor, their eyes sharp as they hunted for men with loose coins. Others wives and mothers, clutching mugs with trembling hands, desperate to drink away the despair of empty cupboards at home. Eleanor ordered a halfpenny dram of gin. It was sharp on her tongue, burning her throat as it slid down, and for a moment she coughed violently, eyes watering. But soon the warmth spread through her chest, dulling the ache in her stomach and the tightness in her shoulders. She took another, and then another, until her body felt looser, lighter. The shame that had gripped her every time she stepped into the street seemed distant now, muffled like the sounds of the city through fog. Around her, the chaos of the palace grew louder. Men leaned against her, their breath hot with drink, their words crude. One grabbed her wrist, another tried to pull her toward a corner. She resisted, slipping away into the crowd, but she could feel the trap closing around her. Gin gave her courage, but it also made her a target. Drunken men were less predictable, more dangerous, and drunken women were easier prey. Still, she returned. Night after night, when the cold of the street cut too deeply, she would push open the heavy door of a gin palace and let the warmth swallow her. She came to know the taste of gin intimately, bitter, sharp, and yet strangely sweet in its promise of forgetfulness. It dulled the gnawing in her belly when she could not afford bread, and it softened the cruel edge of memory when she recalled the life she had once had. But gin was no friend. Already she saw its toll on the faces around her. Women younger than she slumped against the counters, their cheeks flushed, their eyes glazed. Men stumbled out into the night, their pockets emptied, their futures gambled away in a haze of drink. The reformers called gin the mother of vice, and though Eleanor bristled at their moral sermons, she knew there was truth in it. Gin took what little a person had left, their pennies, their health, their self-control, and in exchange it offered only a fleeting reprieve. Eleanor told herself she would use it sparingly, only when she could not bear the weight of the night. Yet as the weeks passed, she found herself craving the warmth more often. She began to think of it not as indulgence but as necessity. Without gin, the streets seemed colder, the men crueler, her own body more unbearable to inhabit. With it, the hours blurred and survival seemed possible. One evening, as she stood in the crowded hall, clutching her small glass, she caught sight of herself in one of the great mirrors. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair damp from the fog, her shawl threadbare, but it was her eyes that startled her most. The fog outside the lodging house still clung to Eleanor's clothes when she finally gave in to what she had long dreaded. Hunger had chewed at her stomach for days. She had walked the length of Whitechapel and back, her shoes worn through, her pride hanging by a thread. Her last few coins had gone to stale bread and a corner of a bed the night before. By dusk, she knew there was nothing left. No work, no family, no kindness left to ask for. There was only one road remaining, a road she had passed by many nights but never stepped upon, The narrow streets of the East End were alive with voices, men calling, women laughing too loudly, the rattle of wheels over cobblestones. Somewhere the sound of a fiddle carried from a tavern. Eleanor drifted into the shadows, her heart pounding as though it would break her ribs. She had seen the other women before, standing under lamplight, painted with powder and weary smiles. She had pitied them once. Tonight, she was one of them. The man found her quickly. They always did. He was not a gentleman, not by any stretch, but he had a chilling despair and hunger in his eyes. His boots scuffed against the stones as he beckoned her, his words half-slurred from gin. Eleanor followed, her body moving while her mind tried to stay elsewhere. They slipped down a narrow passage, away from the light, into the cold embrace of the city's underbelly. Her hands trembled as he pressed the coin into her palm. It was heavy, more than she had seen in weeks, but it burned against her skin like an ember. She wanted to throw it back, to run, but her empty belly reminded her of the truth. Survival had no dignity. The act itself was quick, clumsy, and merciless. She did not cry. She did not scream. She lay still, staring at the cracked wall beside her, trying to count her breaths, trying to imagine she was anywhere else by the river as a child, watching boats drift by. His weight crushed her, his breath reeked of gin, and the stones beneath her cut into her skin. When it was over, he left without a word, without a glance, leaving only the coin and the stench of shame behind him. Eleanor remained where she was. The fog had not yet lifted when Eleanor stepped into the narrow street, her shawl drawn tightly against the dampness. The sound of boots on cobblestones was never something she could ignore. For in the eyes of the law, a woman like her was always suspect, always guilty of something. Policemen prowled the streets of Whitechapel and Soho, their lanterns swinging as they sought out drunken fights, pickpockets, and women who sold themselves to live another day. To be a prostitute in Victorian London was to live beneath the gaze of the Constable-esque truncheon. The law claimed to keep order, yet it seldom extended mercy. Women were stopped and searched without cause, their names taken down in ledgers, their reputations stained beyond repair. Arrests could come at any hour, sometimes for nothing more than standing alone in the wrong place. And once marked by the courts as a common prostitute, the stain was permanent, printed in the language of bureaucracy, leaving no room for redemption. Some policemen treated women like Eleanor as prey to be shaken down for coins, a bribe to look away and let her pass. Others were crueler still, taking advantage of the power their uniform granted, demanding favors in alleyways where no one dared to intervene. Yet there were moments of strange mercy, to a weary constable who turned a blind eye on a freezing night, knowing full well that the streets offered fewer choices than the prison did. But the double standard cut deepest of all. Respectable men who sought out prostitutes in the dark of night were not arrested, nor was their shame recorded in court documents. The woman bore the punishment, the stigma, the label. Eleanor quickly learned that the law was not designed to protect her, but to control her, to remind her that she was disposable, a shadow without rights. Each encounter with the police left her more cautious, more calculating, yet also more weary. She began to understand that survival was not just about enduring the men who paid her, but also about outmaneuvering the officers who patrolled the streets. To stumble in front of the law was to risk the workhouse or the prison cell, both of which promised only hunger and despair. And so Eleanor, like countless others, walked the line between danger and necessity, never certain which uniformed man would bring ruin, and which would allow her to slip past unnoticed. Night after night, Eleanor felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. Yet it was not only hunger or the cold that stalked women like her, it was the invisible danger carried from client to client, lingering in flesh and blood. Disease spread through London's underworld like a whisper, silent at first, then devastating. Syphilis, gonorrhea, chancres, rashes, and fevers, illnesses that struck deep, disfiguring the body and scarring the soul. For the men who came and went, the shame of disease was hidden. They returned to respectable homes, to wives and families, carrying sickness with them into parlors and bedchambers. But for the women, for Eleanor and countless others, disease became part of their very identity. If her body bore the marks, she was branded doubly, not only as a prostitute but as diseased, unclean, untouchable. The government's answer came in the form of the Contagious Diseases Acts, a law that turned women's suffering into a spectacle of control. In garrison towns and naval ports, police were given the power to seize suspected prostitutes and force them into medical examination. Eleanor had heard of it: women held down, inspected with cold instruments, their dignity stripped as surely as their clothing. Refusal meant imprisonment. And though the acts were meant to protect soldiers and sailors, they did nothing to shield the women themselves. They were treated as carriers of infection, as problems to be managed, not human beings to be healed. To live with the fear of disease was to live with a ticking clock. Some women carried scars that never healed. Others wasted away, their skin marked, their minds clouded by the later stages of syphilis. Eleanor, still young, tried not to think of it too often. But she knew the truth, that every night with a stranger was another gamble, another roll of the dice. The city did not speak openly of these sicknesses. They were whispered about in taverns, joked about in barracks, hidden behind veils of hypocrisy. But in the lodging houses and the dim alleys, the reality was plain. Women coughed blood into rags. Some limped, others lost their sight. Still others vanished entirely, swallowed by hospitals or by the pauper's grave. And so, in the shadows of London, disease was both companion and executioner. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, as though cloth alone could keep such horrors at bay. Deep down, she knew that it was not only hunger, cold, or the police that threatened. The nights were long in Victorian London, and for women like Eleanor, they were dangerous in ways that went far beyond hunger or cold. The streets could turn cruel without warning. By gaslight, they looked deceptively alive, men laughing. Horses clattering by, the distant music of a tavern spilling out into the fog. But in the alleys between those lights, in the corners where policemen rarely lingered, brutality waited. Violence was not rare, it was expected. Clients could change in an instant. A man who had seemed jovial after a night of gin might become rough, his grip tightening on an arm or throat, his temper sparked by some imagined slight. Payment could be withheld, blows delivered instead. And for women already worn thin by poverty, there was little choice but to endure or escape. Eleanor learned quickly to read a man's eyes, to gauge whether he would strike, to calculate the risk of fighting back versus letting the moment pass. Yet the dangers did not come only from clients. Gangs roamed the poorer districts, some preying on the women with fists and knives, others demanding a cut of what little they earned. A woman alone walking back to her lodging was easy prey. The police offered no protection. Indeed, they often looked the other way, or worse, mocked the very women they were meant to shield. Eleanor had heard stories of women dragged into shadows by men who were never caught, their bodies found later by the river or in the back lanes, nameless and unmourned. Even among the women themselves, competition sometimes boiled over into cruelty. Each one fought for survival, for the handful of coins that might mean food or a bed for the night. Harsh words could turn into fights, hair pulled, nails scratched across tired skin. Trust was scarce. Desperation eroded solidarity. Eleanor kept to herself when she could, speaking softly, avoiding conflict. But she knew that hunger could make even the friendliest face turn cold. Her small defenses became habits: walking quickly, staying near others when possible, avoiding dark alleys unless she had no choice. She learned where gangs lingered, which streets carried the highest risk, which taverns were safest to slip into for a brief rest. If there was one constant in Eleanor's life beyond the hunger and the cold, it was the weight of judgment. Respectable society, draped in silks and seated comfortably in drawing rooms, rarely hesitated to condemn women like her. Newspapers wrote about fallen women as if they were a plague upon the city, a shame upon the moral order of Britain. Preachers thundered from pulpits about sin and immorality, warning families to guard their daughters against the corruption of the streets. Middle-class matrons clutched their children's hands tighter when passing through poorer neighborhoods, whispering warnings about those women. And yet, when the sun dipped behind the chimneys and the gas lamps flickered to life, Those same men who decried the vice of the slums would slip quietly into its shadows. Solicitors, clerks, soldiers, and even members of parliament found their way to women like Eleanor. They came in carriages, in uniform, in the clothes of gentlemen. They came with coins and promises, sometimes with a false tenderness, other times with cold indifference. By day, they were upstanding figures of the community. By night, they became the very clients who kept the trade alive. The hypocrisy was glaring, yet it was never spoken of openly. If a woman was caught, her reputation was destroyed. She was branded for life. But if a man was found in the same company, the incident was dismissed as a lapse, a bit of wildness forgiven by his peers. One ruin was permanent, the other temporary. Respectability, it seemed, was a cloak stitched only for men. This double standard was woven into the very laws of the time. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed under the guise of protecting public health, targeted women exclusively. Suspected prostitutes could be stopped, examined, and confined in hospitals, their bodies treated as public property. Men, the carriers and customers, faced no such scrutiny. A woman like Eleanor might be forced into an invasive examination on nothing more than suspicion. While her well-dressed client returned to his home without a stain on his name, in the grand drawing rooms of London, society prided itself on its moral order. Families praised chastity, purity, and respectability. But beneath that polished surface ran a river of hypocrisy that touched every level of the city. The very men who condemned women like Eleanor with one breath were the same who sought her out with the next. She lived within this contradiction every day, carrying the burden of shame that others created but never bore themselves. For Eleanor, the hypocrisy was not an abstract injustice, it was her lived reality. Each judgmental stare, each whispered insult, each sermon denouncing her existence was balanced against the quiet knock at a lodging house door or the carriage that stopped in the street at night. Respectability demanded her condemnation. For every woman who lived by the streets, the fear of the workhouse lingered like a shadow that could not be shaken. If the streets were dangerous, degrading, and often deadly, then the workhouse was another kind of prison altogether, a place that promised survival, but at the cost of dignity, identity, and hope. Eleanor, like countless others, lived with the quiet knowledge that one bad season, one long illness, or one cruel stroke of fate could push her through the heavy iron gates of the parish workhouse, never to return the same. The workhouse system, born of the Poor Law reforms of 1834, was designed not to help the poor, but to deter them. Lawmakers, fearful that too much charity would encourage idleness, crafted a system meant to be so harsh, so humiliating, that only the most desperate would enter. Families who crossed its threshold were torn apart at once, husbands, wives, and children sent to different wards, often never to share a meal or a roof together again. For a woman like Eleanor, who had no husband and no family left to lose, the separation was less of a threat than the treatment itself. Workhouse food was deliberately meager, watery gruel, stale bread, perhaps a thin soup with floating scraps of bone. Clothing was not of one's own choosing, but issued like a uniform, rough and uncomfortable. Every act of daily life was regimented by bells and overseers. Privacy was non-existent. To enter the workhouse was to surrender control over your own body, your own name, even your own children if you had them. For women who had once made their way through prostitution, the workhouse was both punishment and stigma. Society, ever eager to draw moral lines, saw their admission as proof of failure, final descent into the category of the undeserving poor. The shame was worse than hunger. Inside, they might be set to tedious, soul-crushing tasks in picking old rope to make oakum, scrubbing endless corridors, or laundering sheets by the dozens. Their labor enriched no one but the institution itself. It was work designed not to produce, but to discipline. What made the workhouse especially terrifying was its permanence. On the streets, however dangerous, there was at least the illusion of choice whom to approach, when to work, how to navigate each night. In the workhouse, there was no such choice. A woman could not leave without permission, and even if she did, she carried the mark of the workhouse with her. To say that one had been inside was to announce failure to the world. Employers, landlords, even neighbors looked at such women as tainted, unworthy of trust or sympathy. For Eleanor, The looming possibility of the workhouse was like an ever-present whisper at the back of her mind. When she walked the cold streets, when she took coins from strangers, when she endured the cruelty of policemen or the hypocrisy of gentlemen, she told herself that anything was better than ending her days in the workhouse ward. Many women shared the same dread, and some would risk everything to avoid it. Some stayed on the streets long after. For Eleanor's survival in the brutal labyrinth of Victorian London was not a solitary effort. The streets were cold, the lodging houses dangerous, the gin palaces fleeting in their comfort, but there was one fragile source of warmth: the companionship of other women who had also fallen into the trade. They were not friends in the ordinary sense. Their lives were too precarious, their trust too worn down by betrayal and desperation. Yet in the shadows of alleys and in the crowded corners of lodging houses, bonds were forged out of necessity. They were sisters of misery, linked not by choice, but by circumstance. On nights when Eleanor returned from the streets empty-handed, she would sometimes find a fellow woman willing to share a crust of bread or a swallow of gin. The kindness was small, but in their world, such gestures meant survival. One evening, when Eleanor had been beaten by a client, and her face bore the dark swelling of his fists, another woman, Mary, a veteran of the streets, helped her wash her wounds with a rag dipped in dirty water. There was no medicine, no clean bandages, but the touch was gentle, and the act itself was a form of defiance against a world that wished them to be utterly alone. In the lodging houses, the women often slept 2 or 3 to a bed, pressed tightly against one another, not only for warmth but also for safety. To sleep alone was to risk being robbed or worse. They would whisper stories in the dark, voices low to avoid the wrath of the keeper. Some shared tales of children they had lost to the workhouse or to disease, their words cracked with sorrow, but steady with the knowledge that someone else was listening. Eleanor herself rarely spoke of her past, but the simple fact that others were there breathing, enduring, and refusing gave her the strength to face another day. Of course, there was rivalry. Women fought fiercely over territory, over clients, over scraps of food. Sometimes harsh words turned to blows, and the lodging house would erupt in shrieks and chaos. But just as quickly, these quarrels could dissolve into uneasy truces. The women knew, deep down, that they were all trapped in the same endless struggle. Hatred could not last when survival depended on an unspoken alliance. The sisterhood of misery was fragile, but it was real. Eleanor came to see it in the way a loaf of stale bread was torn and shared, or the way a woman would stand guard at the mouth of an alley while another plied her trade, warning her if danger approached. These were small acts, invisible to the outside world, but to the women, they were lifelines. Society scorned them, the law hounded them, men used and discarded them, but in each other. They found the faint outline of humanity that the world sought to erase. And so, in the bleakest hours, when hunger gnawed and the cold crept into her bones, Eleanor could still find a flicker of warmth in the company of those around her. Sisters not by blood but by suffering, they clung to each other in defiance of the silence and indifference that surrounded them, in their shared misery. From time to time, Eleanor and the other women would see them the reformers. They came not in the dead of night when the women stumbled back from the streets with aching limbs and hollow eyes, but in daylight, dressed in neat bonnets and heavy skirts that brushed cleanly against the cobblestones. They were women of the middle class, often wives of clergymen, or ladies who belonged to charitable societies. Sometimes they arrived with baskets of bread or donated clothing, sometimes with tracts printed in stiff, moral language that warned of sin and promised salvation. To Eleanor, their presence was a strange mixture of comfort and irritation. On one hand, the offer of a warm garment or a meal could mean the difference between enduring another week and slipping into sickness. On the other, the pity in their eyes stung almost as much as the cold. Their words, though soft and polite, often carried the sharp edge of judgment. They spoke of fallen women, of wasted virtue, of the possibility of being redeemed. Eleanor knew well enough what they meant. She had been cast into the category of the irretrievable, marked by shame unless she agreed to change her life under their supervision. There were rescue homes large, plain houses run by charities or religious groups where women could be taken if they agreed to leave the streets behind. These places promised food, shelter, and honest employment, often in the form of laundry or needlework. But the conditions were strict. A woman who entered was expected to renounce alcohol, to follow rigid schedules of prayer and work, and to submit herself to constant moral instruction. Some of the women Eleanor knew had gone into such homes, only to slip back to the lodging houses weeks later. The rules were suffocating, the labor relentless, and the wages almost non-existent. For women who had lived rough and free, if one could call it freedom, these places often felt more like prisons than sanctuaries. Eleanor herself once accepted an invitation to sit with a kindly-faced reformer, who brought her tea and a small slice of sponge cake. The woman spoke gently, urging Eleanor to think of her future, to imagine herself as a laundress or a servant, restored to society's approval. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor allowed herself to picture it. A small, steady life, perhaps a room of her own, the endless fear of the streets behind her. But then reality intruded. Work as a laundress paid barely enough to survive, and servants were dismissed if their past was ever uncovered. The reformer could offer comfort, but not security. What unsettled Eleanor most was the reformers' conviction that they understood her life. They spoke as though vice were a choice, as though poverty and hunger could be cured by a stern lecture and a bed in a dormitory. They rarely asked about the bruises from violent clients or the despair of being turned away from every respectable employer. Their charity was genuine in part, but it was mixed with the satisfaction of feeling virtuous. To save a woman like Eleanor allowed them to confirm their own moral standing. Still, Eleanor could not entirely resent them. In their way, they were among the few who saw her as something other than an object of use. Their pity was condescending, yet it was still a recognition of her suffering, more acknowledgement than most men ever gave. And in a world where indifference was often deadlier than cruelty, even flawed concern carried weight. Among the women of the lodging house, opinions about reformers varied. Some mocked them, rolling their eyes at the sermons and leaflets. In the stillness of night, when the streets outside her lodging house fell quiet, except for the shuffle of rats and the echo of distant cartwheels, Eleanor would lie awake, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. In those rare moments when her body was not claimed by hunger, sickness, or exhaustion, her mind would slip into another world, a world of imagining. She thought of a life where she wore dresses of clean cotton, where she did not fear the police or the cruel words of strangers, where perhaps she worked as a seamstress in a small shop, or kept a modest home with a husband who treated her kindly. These dreams were fragile things, as fleeting as the morning fog over the Thames, but they were what kept her soul from breaking completely. She sometimes heard stories whispered among the women she knew. A girl who had found work in a laundry, taken in by a widow who had once walked the same path, another who had managed to leave the streets by marrying a man who had once been her client. These tales were passed around like small treasures, spoken in hushed tones during late-night conversations in the cold corners of lodging houses. They offered proof, however rare, that escape was possible. Eleanor clung to such stories, though she never said aloud how much she longed for them. Yet reality pressed hard against her dreams. For every woman who escaped, dozens more fell deeper into ruin. Disease, alcohol, violence, they consumed lives quickly and without mercy. There were nights when London itself seemed to swallow Eleanor whole, damp, when the fog was so thick it clung to her skin like damp wool, and the streets turned silent, save for the occasional clatter of hooves or the drunken shout of a passer-by. On those nights the men did not come. The lamps still flickered along the narrow alleys, and the women still waited in doorways and against brick walls, but no coin changed hands. For Eleanor, those were the most dangerous nights of all. Without customers, there was no money. Without money, there was no bread, no gin to dull the cold, and certainly no bed at the lodging house. Hunger was an old companion, but it became a sharper torment when paired with exhaustion and the knowledge that she had nowhere to go. She would wrap her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and try to walk the streets to keep warm. Her stomach gnawing at itself, her body weak from fatigue. Sometimes she would crouch in the shadow of a doorway, watching rats dart through the gutters, wondering if her life was worth much more in the eyes of the city. Other women suffered beside her. On those nights of hunger, there was a quiet despair that settled over them all. They might share a crust of stale bread if one had managed to save it, or pass around a tin mug of weak gin. But there were also fights, desperate quarrels over scraps, or over which corner belonged to whom. Hunger stripped away civility as surely as it stripped away flesh, leaving only survival. When she was too tired to walk, Eleanor sometimes sat near the river. The Thames was black and wide, its smell sour with refuse. Illness was the shadow that followed every woman in the trade, creeping closer with each passing year. For Eleanor, it began with a cough, rough, dry, and constant. At first she dismissed it. The damp London nights left many throats raw, and the fog carried soot and smoke that choked the lungs. But this cough did not leave. It grew harsher, rattling her chest until she doubled over in the street. One hand pressed to her ribs, the other clutching the wall for balance. Soon came the fevers. Her skin would burn hot 1 hour and turn clammy the next. She shook beneath her thin shawl, unable to get warm, yet sweating as though she had run miles. The other women recognized the signs, though no one dared say the word aloud. Consumption. Tuberculosis was everywhere, passed in the air of crowded lodging houses, brothels, and workhouses. A death sentence stretched out slowly, one rasping breath at a time. Yet illness offered no escape from necessity. Eleanor still had to work. Hunger would not vanish because her chest ached, and her landlord did not forgive rent because her hands trembled. Night after night, she forced herself back into the streets. Rouge painted across a face grown pale, her smile masking the exhaustion beneath. She learned to steady herself against lampposts when the coughing fits came, to turn her head so as not to alarm or repel a potential client. Her body was failing, but the trade demanded she go on, as the men for the most part did not notice. Drunk or hurried, they looked at her figure more than her face, never lingering long enough to see the dullness in her eyes. Some did notice and walked away. Rejection stung more deeply now than it ever had before, for she knew it meant another night with no bread, no gin to soothe her lungs, and no coins for her bed. Then there were the other illnesses, syphilis, gonorrhea, the countless unnamed fevers that swept through the poorest quarters. Eleanor saw what they did to the women around her, sores that would not heal, blindness, madness, bodies eaten away from the inside. Eleanor had once been a girl of 19, her cheeks still soft with youth and her hair dark and full. But as the years stretched thin across the cobbled streets of London, time showed no mercy. For women in her trade, beauty was currency. And currency, once spent, was rarely replenished. By her mid-20s, she noticed the first whispers of age in the mirror of a gin palace-hollowed cheeks. Tired eyes ringed in shadows, and the sharp edge of despair etched into her expression. What the streets demanded most, she could no longer easily give. Men, especially those who sought brief distraction in dim alleyways, often looked past her for younger faces, girls, even more desperate, often still in their teens, selling the very thing Eleanor once had: innocence. The cruel truth of the Victorian world was that a prostitute's career was never long. The streets chewed women up quickly, spitting them out when they were no longer fresh enough to lure attention. A few years of standing in the fog and cold, of drinking to forget, of hunger gnawing away at body and soul, these things aged women faster than nature ever could. Eleanor felt it in her bones and the ache of her body after nights spent with men who treated her not as human but as a purchase. Her illness, already creeping inside her, only sharpened the decline. Yet beauty was more than a face-it, was an air, a vitality that could be sensed. And as her vitality faded, so too did her hope. She saw it in the way men passed her by without even looking, in the way landladies refused to let her linger without money, in the way younger women eyed her warily as if she were a ghost of their own future. Eleanor began to feel invisible. The city no longer looked at her except to scorn or shove her aside. And with invisibility came despair. If her youth was gone and her health was failing, what was left? What future awaited a woman no longer wanted by the streets and too broken to return to respectable work? For Eleanor, as for so many others, there was no easy answer. She clung to survival, day by day. For Eleanor and many like her, the streets were a gamble, cold, dangerous, and unpredictable. But not all women in her position worked under the open sky or in dark alleys. Some found their way into the dim, shuttered houses of organized brothels. These establishments, though often hidden in plain sight, were part of a vast and unspoken industry that catered to London's appetite for pleasure. From shabby rooms in working-class districts to more refined establishments in wealthier quarters, the brothel world carried its own hierarchy, rules, and cruelties. At the top of this hidden empire stood the madam's women who managed the house, enforced discipline, and dealt with landlords, police, and clients. To some, they appeared as protectors, offering a roof over one's head and a degree of safety from the violence of the streets. But more often, they were exploiters. Every woman under their roof owed rent for her bed, a cut of her earnings for the house, and often fees for clothing, food, or gin sold at inflated prices. What looked like security could quickly turn into debt bondage, trapping women as surely as chains. The rules of a brothel varied. Some women were expected to entertain clients with laughter, song, or cards before disappearing upstairs. In others, silence and obedience were the only requirements. Some houses enforced strict schedules, requiring women to be available every night, regardless of illness or exhaustion. Refusal was rarely tolerated. Madams, while occasionally maternal, could also be brutal, beating women who disobeyed or throwing them back onto the streets without warning. Brothels were also deeply entangled with the law, rather with those who bent it. Police officers were often bribed to turn a blind eye, and magistrates sometimes frequented the very establishments they condemned in court. Respectable men doctors, lawyers, businessmen, even members of parliament were known to slip through brothel doors in the quiet of night, their reputations intact by daylight. The hypocrisy was staggering, yet it ensured that brothels, for Eleanor and countless women like her, the trade was not simply a chapter of survival, it was a brand burned into the skin of one's reputation, stain that society never allowed to wash away. Once a woman was whispered about as a prostitute, she carried that shadow for life, no matter how desperately she tried to step back into respectability. The Victorians spoke often of fallen women, a phrase that carried the weight of eternal damnation. To fall was to tumble out of grace, to lose one's worth in the eyes of respectable society. And in that fall, there was no ladder offered back up. This stigma was cruelly permanent. Even if Eleanor left the streets, even if she found honest work scrubbing floors or sewing shirts, her past would follow her like a curse. Gossip traveled faster than mercy. A neighbor might sneer, a landlord might evict her, or a potential employer might refuse her work, muttering that she had no character. Respectability was the currency of the working poor, and once it was lost, every door seemed to slam shut. Marriage, too, became nearly impossible. Men might pay for a woman's body in the dark, but few would offer her a wedding ring in the light of day. A woman who had lived in the trade was deemed unfit to be a wife, or mother corrupt, diseased, and untrustworthy. Even charity was stingy. Some missions and reform homes existed to rescue fallen women, but these were strict, judgmental places that often demanded total submission, repentance, and a life of drudgery. Many women felt more trapped inside these saviors' walls than they had in the brothel. The stigma bled into daily existence. A woman with such a mark might find herself refused by shopkeepers, avoided by neighbors, or cursed in the street. Children of prostitutes often inherited the scorn, treated as tainted by birth. In a society obsessed with purity and appearances, no amount of honesty, labor, or years of good conduct could erase what had once been whispered. For Eleanor, this knowledge was perhaps the most suffocating burden of all. Poverty, hunger, and violence could be endured, if only there was hope of escape. But stigma stole hope itself. It turned survival into a sentence, ensuring that once the world had seen her as fallen, she could never again be allowed to rise. The winter came early that year. The fog that once only cloaked the streets now seemed to bite, turning to frost that settled into every crack of London's worn brick and cobblestone. For Eleanor, it was the beginning of the end. Her body, already weakened by disease, was no longer strong enough to withstand the cold, or the hunger that gnawed at her day after day. The nights stretched endlessly, the gas lamps flickering weakly through the mist, and each gust of icy wind seemed to steal a little more of her strength. She still tried to work, but fewer and fewer men came. Her once bright eyes were now hollow, her cheeks sunken, her hair unkempt beneath her thin shawl. Men passed her by without even a glance, or worse, with a sneer. She was no longer a temptation, but a reminder of decay. Each rejection was a wound sharper than hunger itself, because it meant another night without coins for bread or a bed at the Dawes house. The hunger became unbearable. Some nights she searched through the refuse of the markets, hoping for a crust of bread, a bruised apple, or a bone to gnaw. On the worst nights, she curled herself against the stone steps of a church or huddled near a sewer, great for a breath of rising warmth. Sleep brought no peace, only shallow dozing, broken by shivers, rats scurrying, and the echo of footsteps in the fog. Loneliness pressed down heavier than the cold, for by then she had few, if any, companions left. The other women kept their distance. Sickness was feared, and desperation made kindness rare. Her cough worsened, wet and rattling, and each fit of it left her doubled over in pain, clinging to walls or lampposts to steady herself. There were whispers of consumption, the wasting disease that seemed to stalk the poorest quarters of the city. Eleanor could feel it hollowing her out, leaving her weaker each day. Yet still she forced herself to walk, to stand, to call softly to passing men, though her voice often broke into a rasp before the words were finished. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, she began to wonder if she would see another spring. There was no family waiting for her, no home to return to, no charity that would welcome her without conditions too harsh to bear. There was only the endless street, the fog, and the cruel bite of the wind. In those final days, Eleanor thought often of warmth, not just of fire or food, but of the warmth of touch, the warmth of being wanted or remembered. Yet such warmth was as unreachable as the sun beyond the gray sky. What remained was cold, hunger, and the creeping awareness that her... Eleanor's final days slipped quietly into nights, blurred together in cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The city around her carried on as it always had. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. The cries of street vendors rang out at dawn, and the Thames rolled endlessly under bridges crowded with commuters. But for Eleanor, time had slowed to a crawl. Each morning she woke weaker. Each evening she found it harder to stand, and each night she wondered if she would live to see another dawn. Her last moments were not surrounded by friends or family. There was no hand to hold, no gentle voice offering comfort. Instead, she collapsed one bitter night in a narrow alley off Whitechapel Road. Her thin shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders, as though it might protect her from the cold. Passers-by noticed her slumped figure, but no one stopped. Her body was lifted onto a rough wooden cart, alongside others who had died in the night, the homeless, the sick, the nameless poor, who had no one to claim them. She was taken to the workhouse infirmary, where a clerk scribbled her name into the register. Eleanor Brown, age uncertain, prostitute. Her life reduced to a few words, filed away among thousands of others. No obituary was printed, no mourners gathered, no priest knew her story well enough to speak her name with meaning. Instead, she was buried in a pauper's grave, in a crowded patch of earth on the edge of the city, where bodies were laid one atop another, marked only by a number in a ledger. The grave was unmarked, the soil quickly covered over, ready for the next poor soul. Within weeks, even her resting place was indistinguishable from the countless others who had been swallowed by poverty and silence. And yet Eleanor's story was not unique. Thousands of women in Victorian England met the same and worn down by hunger, disease, and despair, their deaths unnoticed by the very society that had used, judged, and then discarded them. They were branded as fallen women, condemned by reputation, and denied the dignity of being remembered. They lived in the shadows, and when they were gone, the city simply carried on, as though they had never existed at all. But in truth, they were there. They walked the gaslit streets, whispered through alleyways, and waited under flickering lamps for the strangers who would use them. They laughed once, loved once, dreamed once, just as others did. And though history seldom wrote their names,